not saying to minimize your own beliefs or that like anything goes, but Jesus is constantly including people and bringing people together that didn't belong together and didn't necessarily agree. The good news of Jesus is that everyone is invited, and we need to be honest about the ways that we can be resistant or get in the way of that invitation. It seems like it's human nature to try and just fill up whatever space we're given. We try and cram as much extra stuff in there as we can. And I think there are times we do the same thing with our faith. We have this simple, beautiful gift, this freedom in Christ, and we shove extra things into it that weren't meant to be there. Rules upon rules, identity markers that we rely on. We're afraid that grace alone isn't enough. So we add one more thing and one more thing. So we need a wad of napkins in our other pocket so we can sit up straight. We're in the book of Galatians today, and Jeff read our passage earlier. I want to give a little context for what's happening in the Galatian region at the time. So this region of Asia Minor, where Galatia sits, was a pretty diverse region. It had all kinds of people, including a large Jewish population. And the Jews in this area of the Roman Empire in Galatia, they were privy to a very special thing. They had a thing called the Jewish exception, where in the Roman Empire, all were required to praise Caesar as Lord, to consider Caesar divine. The Jews in Galatia were exempt from this rule. And in this area, when both Jews and non-Jews are becoming followers of Jesus, it's happening across this whole area, you can imagine if you are a newly converted, non-Jewish person, what we call the Gentiles or the uncircumcised, you might begin to think to yourself, if I want to get out of the pressure of following or worshiping Caesar, why don't I just convert to Judaism and hop onto the little exception train that they already have going for themselves? On top of that, if you're a non-Jew, a Gentile, the uncircumcised, you might look at Judaism with this very clear lines and kind of clear rules that what it means to be Jewish and be tempted to think, if that's all that I need to do to please God, especially if you're like a rule follower, what if I could just follow these simple things and make God happy? Some of us love systems and we love lists. We're like, God, just give me the things and I will do it. Make it clear for me. And then all around you, as a Gentile Christian, you see these Jews that are still practicing their Judaism along with their Christianity. And you could begin to think maybe that I'm not quite as special of a Christian, or I'm incomplete, or I'm lesser because I just have this simple faith. So all this is swirling around in the minds and the hearts of the Galatians as Paul writes this letter. And Paul wants to tell them that God is inviting them into this relationship that's messier than a bunch of rules sometimes. They want the Galatians to trust God, trust Him for the work that's already been done on their behalf, and wants them to move beyond these old ways of living in these really segregated boundaries and bounded lines of who's in and who's out of Jew and Gentile. Right before our text happens today, in the second chapter of Galatians, Paul tells this story where he says, I was just up in Jerusalem, and I met with Peter and James and John, and they're the leaders of the church. And when I was there, I had this guy Titus with me. And Titus, he is about as Gentile, as non-Jewish as you can imagine. He's from the Isle of Crete, and he is a Greek of all Greeks. And Paul says, if these leaders of the church didn't make Titus convert to Judaism, pick up these old practices of circumcision and Sabbath laws and dietary restrictions, all they asked was you remember the poor. If you didn't require it of Titus, Why are you Galatians requiring it of yourselves? And Paul wants to emphasize these things don't just hurt us individually, but they hurt our community. So Paul hops into this story where he shares about Peter, the same guy from Jerusalem. Because Peter had been spreading the good news of Jesus around the world, and he is in Antioch. And Peter's been in Antioch, he's eating with all these non-Jews, these Gentile people. And for the people of the time, this would have been a huge cultural shift because Jews and Gentiles did not eat together. It made the Jewish people think they were unclean. And this would have blown the minds of anybody in the area. But this was the freedom of the gospel that Peter had been preaching. The gospel isn't just for the Jews, but also for the entire world. And Peter's living this free life. And then while he is there, these missionaries from Jerusalem show up, these other Jews. And Peter begins to pull back from eating with those who he ate with before. And then Paul calls him out for this. He says, this isn't the freedom that you talked about. You're putting distance between those who you used to accept. It's that high school lunch table all over again. And Paul says, this isn't just awkward. It isn't just rude. It flies in the face of the freedom that you proclaimed. Peter's rebuilding the old system of circumcision and dietary laws and purity codes, the things that have been torn down by Jesus. And Paul calls him out. So that behavior doesn't just confuse people. It builds lines and builds walls between people who God has called together. And Paul is saying to the Galatians, y'all are doing the exact same thing that Peter was doing. So I moved here about 2 years ago, October of 23, and I came from South Dakota, where my wife is from. But I actually didn't grow up there. I grew up in Eastern Canada and moved to South Dakota 12 years ago. And I moved there fresh off being in a band, and I was your classic skinny jeans, big beard, band dude. Not much has changed. But I do wear dad shoes more often because I'm getting old, my back hurts. But I showed up in this, what I didn't realize was cowboy country, full of cattle auctions and cowboy boots and culture shock for me. And then I joined this country band to top things off. And I was showing up in these tiny little South Dakota towns, playing at street dances and weddings, and all I see around me is a sea of bootcut Wranglers and big belt buckles and cowboy hats. And I think to myself, I better go buy some cowboy boots really fast. So I'm getting some strange looks from all these dudes here with their little cowboy getup. And the irony is that even if I had gone and bought like all the right things to look like a cowboy, they would have known that I was not a cowboy. There was no way that facade was going to hold any water. And here's the thing. We can often do the same thing with our faith. Just adopting the outward signs of Judaism didn't make someone more righteous for those people. But it is tempting to try and put on the right stuff to feel like you're on the inside, like you have the right external identity markers to feel part of the group. It's a human instinct. It's a survival mechanism. But becoming a cowboy is one thing, but becoming a Christian is something else. The problem is we can rely so much on these identity markers, these things we put on, that begins to put up walls or send out signs that some people don't fit in, or it keeps others out. We rebuild these walls that Jesus has torn down. We put these old chains back on that have been broken off. When I was in high school, I volunteered at this summer camp, and when the campers were gone on the weekend, we played games and hang out with the counselors. We played this one game, card game called King Mao. And it is the stupidest card game you can ever imagine. I despised playing this game because the point of the game is to get rid of all your cards. But the first rule of the game is you can't talk about the rules. It's basically the Fight Club of card games. And the way the game goes, whenever you break a rule, you're penalized by being given a card. So you don't know the rules, you're trying to play, they keep giving you more and more cards, and then when you win a round, you get to make up your own rule for the game that nobody else knows. So it's the game where the insiders keep winning, and the new people like me get frustrated and lose and have no hope of ever winning the game, ever. This is the stupid game, King Mao. I'm still a little... It's something for me. This is what happens all the time. Sometimes in church, we don't mean to maybe, but we do the same thing where we create these rules, these laws, these systems where we send a message like, you can't quite belong here unless you become just like us. And I get the temptation. It's uncomfortable to be around people who think differently, who have different practices or different values. But if we believe that Jesus is inviting everyone to turn toward him, if we believe that Jesus is always inviting those on the outside in, that Jesus constantly talked to the people who were righteous and said that you aren't the ones that are being invited necessarily, it's often the outsiders that are being included. We have to admit that sometimes we put up these walls that are not made by us they're made by us or by humans and not made by Jesus. And if we try and live that way, it's going to be a bit uncomfortable for us. And I'm not saying to minimize your own beliefs or that like anything goes, but Jesus is constantly including people and bringing people together that didn't belong together and didn't necessarily agree. The good news of Jesus is that everyone is invited. And we need to be honest about the ways that we can be resistant or get in the way of that invitation.